Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lynn Dittrich, and I am from the Pedagogy Institute, and I'm presenting on how immersive technologies can be used for experiential learning and teacher education. So my study really is contextualized within the field of higher education and how higher education has an important role of preparing the professional labor force. So since one of the goals of higher education is to prepare the next labor force, how can we use immersive technologies in that training, in preparing students for the future workplace? So there's often a theory-practice gap that's discussed in the literature, showing that there's a need for students to be more closer to practice. And so I'm interested in looking at how can these immersive technologies be better established within teacher education. As Simon has discussed, these technologies are very well established in maritime, for instance, and they're also well established in fields like medicine, but not so much in teacher education. So I'm curious about how they can be used effectively for training pre-service teachers. Within the Norwegian context, one huge problem is attrition. So it's difficult for the field to retain new teachers, and a research study from 2015 showed that about 33% of new teachers leave the profession after completing their studies. So I'm interested in how can we better train students on specific skills. So what can technologies like simulations and more immersive technologies help us with in terms of helping students be more confident and to increase their self-efficacy as teachers before they even reach the classroom. So for instance, focusing on classroom management skills, focusing on leading a discussion. And then another study in 2015 found that, after a survey of 96 Norwegian student teachers, they found that students had a stronger preference for more practice-based knowledge rather than theory-based knowledge. So this raises questions about epistemology. So where do students draw from in terms of their knowledge? Do they draw from their practical experiences, learning by doing, or do they draw more from textbooks or lectures? So then this prompts the question then, how can we use immersive technologies, like for instance simulations, to provide robust training opportunities for students so that they get more access for practice within their study programs? Just briefly, another report from NORCUT found that this theory-practice gap debate that's been ongoing, it really just confirms that students leave education and they get into the workplace and they have to themselves translate theory into practice and translate how do they use this university-produced knowledge in the classroom so that they feel confident in the classroom. My study's theoretical foundation draws from socio-cultural learning perspectives. In particular, we look at how do we use technologies to mediate professional learning. We also use the situated learning theory. When I say we, I'm referring to my first study, which I'm doing with my co-supervisor. And here we look at, for instance, how can professional learning and practice take place within meaningful contexts, within authentic contexts that can be provided by immersive technologies. So my first planned article includes it's a qualitative design. It includes 21 teacher education students that are online based. And these students tried out a mixed reality simulation. And the focus was mathematics didactics as well as pedagogy. We collected data through video observation, through students writing written reflection logs, as well as peer-led focus groups after the actual simulation experience. And we used thematic analysis to analyze the data. So the simulation we used was a desktop simulation. If you look at the spectrum between low immersive technologies and higher immersive technologies, desktop simulations are less immersive in the sense that they can be accessed remotely, and they aren't they don't make use of these head-mounted displays. So our students joined the simulation remotely via Zoom. We conducted this study last semester, and so it was really convenient for the students to be able to access it remotely, as they also are online students. So this simulation uses a unique technique called human in the loop, also known as digital puppeteering. So what happens is there's a simulation expert in the background who embodies the avatars and who controls their responses. And the students can practice, for example, in different contexts, for example, K-12 classrooms, educational leadership practice, or even parent-teacher conferences. So these are the different options available with the simulation. This just describes how the actual simulation works. So we have an interactor, again, who controls the avatars and their movements. We have avatars who represent the pupils in the classroom, and they have different personalities, from extroverted to introverted, and even different learning needs or special needs. We have the student who joins and does not see the interactor. So the interactor is in a remote location, and the student just sees the avatars and interacts as though they were in a real classroom. In our case, this happened via Zoom. And then we have observers who can give the student feedback after the simulation. They can reflect whether it's collaborative, and they can discuss what went wrong, what went well, and how they can learn from this experience. This is an example of the avatars and their different personalities. We have Dev, who's quite studious and structured and creative. We have Savannah, who's a little bit shy and introverted. So what we found in the simulation is that the student teachers had to actually notice this and try and draw in Savannah and include her when she wasn't getting included in the rest of the classroom discussions. And then we have Ethan, who's very extroverted and who speaks up and is energetic and confident. And one of the other things we found when we did the experiment is that the student teachers recognized these students. They were like, after they'd been practice teaching, of course, they said, I recognize students who act like Ethan or students like Savannah who are shy, that you have to really bring in. So looking at our research question on the perceived usefulness of this particular mixed reality simulation, we found mixed reactions from the students. Although generally positive, students found it engaging and fun. They said it was very much like being in the classroom because they recognized some of the scenarios that came up. But we say mixed reactions because there were, of course, students who were a bit critical to the technology. So they were both positive and negative, but generally students had positive sentiments. Fidelity issues come up a lot with immersive technologies because research shows that sometimes more high fidelity technologies can be more engaging for the students, but we found that students were still able to find the experience useful regardless of the fidelity issues. One of the students mentioned that it was a bit robotic, dealing with these avatars. Another finding was that students need to be better familiarized with the technology and the scenario. They need to be better prepared beforehand and have a more detailed briefing beforehand. So this could help us with planning learning designs. How much more time do we need to spend on the pre-briefing to explain how the technology works, to explain the scenario to the students? And then a surprising and interesting finding for us was that the peer interaction and the student-led group discussions afterwards were very important for the students. So getting to confirm their choices. So when they were in the simulation and they had to make didactic choices, confirming those with their peers afterwards was quite important to students, and discussing, different dilemmas was useful for the students. So these are some examples of excerpts. I'll just rush through them because I'm mindful of time. So some students found this very fun, even though it wasn't realistic. So again, this speaks to authenticity. So even though simulation is not necessarily high fidelity, students do find it engaging. Another thing that was important for this particular student in group 4 was that his peer, who was the teacher, took the role so seriously. So he took on this professional role, and that for the other students made the experience, I quote, elevated the experience. as the student says. Another student said, fantastic, this can be an advantage in teacher education. Another student showed surprise. Initially, they weren't sure how realistic it would seem, but then they say here they captured the nuances so well. So again, recognizing professional scenarios, the student was very surprised about how meaningful this experience was. And then to speak to my point about the group discussions, students said that these were quite linked to the learning outcomes for them. They said that they couldn't have gotten a lot out of the learning outcomes had it not been for these group discussions. And then again, the group discussions are even more important than the actual simulation, one student says, or almost more important. So they really do value having to collaborate and reflect together afterwards. And then this quote from a student shows that students have an appetite for educators to include more digital tools in their learning. So they say that we need to update the toolbox that's used in higher education. So implications for design. So after this study, one of the things that we found was that, again, it's important for students to be familiar with the technology, familiar with the scenario in the debriefing, the simulation experience itself, the debriefing that takes place with peers and educators is important. And of course, the student-led group discussions, and this includes collaborating together and using simulations, not just for the sake of the technology, but with an intention for dialogic engagement and social interaction. Thank you.